Judiciary head has signaled earlier today
a pro-government rally today in the streets of Tehran of Supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Iran's foreign minister saying today the protests are under control.
Total safety, total security.
May 8, 2018, a signature withdrawal that reverberated across 3 continents. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action dismantled, not through congressional debate, not through United Nations consensus, through executive decision. The Iran nuclear deal, painstakingly negotiated over years involving 6 world powers, terminated with a stroke of policy reversal. Why that moment? Why that specific timing in the geopolitical calendar? The question isn't just about what happened, it's about what the timing enabled. Trump's approach to Iran wasn't conventional diplomacy. It wasn't traditional warfare either. It occupied a space between economic suffocation and military intimidation. Maximum pressure. The phrase became doctrine. But pressure toward what end? Regime change was never officially stated. New negotiations were always theoretically possible. Yet the actions suggested something more absolute. The language deployed was deliberate. All options remain on the table. Always on the table. Never removed. Never categorically ruled out. This wasn't ambiguity through confusion. This was strategic uncertainty weaponized. When does a threat become more effective than its execution? When the target can never be certain which moment might trigger escalation. Iran faced an opponent who communicated through unpredictability. Traditional diplomatic calculations obsolete. Standard deterrence theory insufficient. Consider the sequence: treaty withdrawal, immediate sanctions reimposition, designation of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist organization. Each step escalated economic and diplomatic isolation. Each move was technically within presidential authority, yet collectively sharpened tone. They formed a pattern that looked less like policy adjustment and more like systematic strangulation. But there was something else, something less visible in the public announcements. The pressure campaign coincided with regional power shifts. Saudi Arabia was being courted with unprecedented arms deals. Israel was receiving recognition of Jerusalem as capital. The Abraham Accords were being conceptualized. Was Iran being isolated? Or was the Middle East being reorganized with Iran deliberately positioned outside the new architecture? 2. Development, sanctions, consequences, and regional shockwaves. The architecture of economic warfare, hardened tone, November 2018. The sanctions snapback reached full implementation. Not just Iranian government entities, not just military enterprises, every sector, banking, energy, shipping, insurance, manufacturing, any entity worldwide conducting business with Iran faced potential exclusion from the U.S. financial system. This wasn't a trade embargo in the traditional sense, this was financial architecture used as a weapon. The mechanism was sophisticated. Secondary sanctions meant that non-American companies had to choose access to Iranian markets or access to American markets. There was no middle ground. European corporations, despite their government's objections, began withdrawing from Iran. Oil tankers found their insurance coverage canceled. Banks refused to process transactions even for humanitarian goods. The global financial system's dependence on dollar clearing meant that U.S. Treasury decisions in Washington could strangle commerce in Tehran without a single military asset deployed. Ray's voice: we are going to bring Iranian oil exports to zero. Not reduction, not limitation, elimination. Could this actually be achieved? Probably not entirely. But the declaration itself shifted negotiations. When you start from zero tolerance, any compromise position still represents massive pressure. China continued purchasing. India sought waivers, but the volume plummeted. From over 2 million barrels daily to a fraction of that capacity. The rial collapsed. Iranian currency lost over 60% of its value in months. What does that mean on the ground? Savings evaporated. Import costs exploded. Medicine prices surged beyond reach for ordinary citizens. The government had reserves, yes, but reserves drain when exports are choked and imports remain necessary. This was economic warfare designed to create internal pressure. The assumption, suffering populations demand policy changes from their governments. The military shadow. Yet economics alone doesn't explain the full picture. Military signaling accompanied every sanctions phase, aircraft carrier deployments to the Persian Gulf, B-52 bomber movements publicized through official channels, troop reinforcements in neighboring territories. These weren't responses to specific incidents initially, they were preemptive demonstrations. May 2019, tensions peaked, tankers attacked in the Gulf of Oman. Who was responsible? Evidence pointed toward Iranian involvement according to U.S. intelligence. Iran denied culpability. But does attribution matter as much as escalation dynamics? The incident provided justification for further military positioning, more sanctions, more isolation, more pressure. June 2019, an American surveillance drone shot down over the Strait of Hormuz. Iran claimed it violated airspace. The U.S. insisted it was in international territory. Trump ordered military strikes, then canceled them, 10 minutes before execution. Why? He later stated he was told casualties would reach 150 people. Was this restraint, or was this calculated demonstration that military options existed but weren't being used yet? The cancellation itself became messaging. It showed force readiness. It demonstrated decision-making power concentrated in one individual. It kept Iran perpetually uncertain about which incident might trigger actual military response. Cyber operations were allegedly executed instead, less visible, equally hostile. Attacks on Iranian missile command systems were reported. Tehran acknowledged technical disruptions but downplayed their significance. January 2020, Baghdad International Airport. A drone strike eliminated Qasem Soleimani, not a random military commander, the head of the Quds Force, a figure who had orchestrated Iranian influence across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen. This wasn't warning shots. This was decapitation of military leadership through targeted assassination on foreign soil. The escalation threshold had been crossed. Iran's response came days later. Ballistic missiles struck U.S. bases in Iraq. Dozens of service members sustained traumatic brain injuries. Initially, the administration downplayed casualties. Headaches they were characterized as. Later, the injury count rose, over 100. Both sides had now demonstrated kinetic capability. Both sides stepped back from further immediate escalation, but the precedent was established. Direct military confrontation had occurred. It could occur again. Regional domino effects. Iran doesn't exist in isolation. Every pressure point on Tehran sends ripples across the Middle East. Consider the chessboard. Iraq hosts both American troops and Iranian-backed militias. Lebanon's Hezbollah receives Iranian support. Syria's Assad regime survives partly through Iranian intervention. Yemen's Houthis fight with Iranian weapons. Squeeze Iran, and all these proxy relationships face resource constraints. Saudi Arabia watched the pressure campaign with strategic interest. Riyadh and Tehran had been regional rivals for decades. Sunni versus Shia power competition. Oil market control disputes. Proxy conflicts in Yemen. The Trump administration's hardline against Iran aligned perfectly with Saudi regional objectives. The relationship wasn't subtle. Trump's first foreign visit as president? Saudi Arabia. Arms deals worth hundreds of billions announced. Intelligence sharing deepened. Diplomatic coordination intensified. Israel operated on similar calculations. Iranian presence in Syria positioned hostile forces near Israeli borders. Hezbollah in Lebanon possessed missile arsenals threatening Israeli cities. Netanyahu's government had opposed the nuclear deal from inception. Trump's withdrawal validated Israeli security doctrine. The subsequent Abraham Accords normalizing relations between Israel and UAE, Bahrain, later others. These agreements didn't explicitly target Iran, but strategically, they isolated Tehran further. Arab states and Israel finding common ground, common threat perception, common opposition to Iranian regional influence. Europe found itself in an uncomfortable position. The EU had supported the nuclear deal. European companies had anticipated renewed trade with Iran. But when forced to choose between Iranian markets and American markets, the decision was economically predetermined. Germany, France, Britain attempted to create alternative payment mechanisms. Instex, the instrument in support of trade exchanges, theoretically allowing Iran to trade despite U.S. sanctions. Practically, it never functioned at meaningful scale. The dollar system's gravitational pull proved too strong. Russia and China took different approaches. Moscow maintained military cooperation with Tehran. Arms sales continued. Diplomatic support in international forums persisted. But Russia wasn't willing to sacrifice its own relationships with Gulf states to defend Iran completely. China increased oil purchases at discounted rates. Opportunistic economics. When Iran's desperate for buyers, prices become negotiable. Beijing secured favorable terms while maintaining sufficient distance to avoid secondary sanctions. The energy weapon. Oil markets don't respond to geopolitics through simple cause and effect. But Iran controls the Strait of Hormuz. Roughly 20% of global oil supply passes through that narrow waterway. 20% daily. Any sustained closure would send energy prices into crisis territory. Iran couldn't win a military confrontation with the United States, but it could inflict economic damage globally by disrupting energy flows. The threat was never fully executed. Tankers were harassed, mines were placed, insurance rates spiked. But complete closure? That would invite military response that Tehran probably couldn't withstand. Yet the capability existed. The possibility remained. Energy markets priced this uncertainty continuously. Every escalation report shifted futures prices. Every de-escalation statement brought temporary relief. American energy independence changed these calculations somewhat. Shale oil production had reduced U.S. reliance on Middle Eastern imports, but global markets remain interconnected. European allies, Asian economies, still dependent on Gulf oil, price spikes anywhere affect prices everywhere. The pressure on Iran was designed to avoid triggering supply disruptions that would harm American allies and global economy. But was this balance sustainable indefinitely? Internal Iranian dynamics. Sanctions don't just pressure governments, they reshape societies. Iranian middle class saw living standards deteriorate. Professional salaries couldn't keep pace with inflation. Young educated population faced diminishing prospects. Brain drain accelerated as those with options sought opportunities abroad. Did this create pressure on the regime? Absolutely. Did it lead to the policy changes Washington sought? That's less clear. Iranian leadership responded through mixed strategies. Hardliners gained influence, arguing that negotiations with the West were pointless. Moderates who had advocated for the nuclear deal lost credibility. When the agreement you championed gets unilaterally abandoned, your political position weakens domestically. Rouhani's government, which had sold the deal as a path to economic integration, faced criticism from both internal hardliners and suffering citizens. The regime also adapted economically. Black market networks expanded. Sanctions evasion became increasingly sophisticated. Oil was transferred ship to ship in international waters. Front companies obscured transactions. Cryptocurrency usage increased. Illicit networks aren't as efficient as legitimate commerce, but they provide survival mechanisms. Total economic collapse? Avoided. Severe economic damage? Absolutely. Regime change triggered, not within the time frame of maximum pressure's most intense period. Revolutionary Guard economic networks actually gained power during sanctions. When legitimate businesses struggle, entities with access to black market channels thrive. This created an ironic dynamic. The pressure campaign meant to weaken the regime's hardline elements inadvertently strengthened the very actors most opposed to compromise with the West. Sanctions created economic opportunities for those positioned to exploit them. Future trajectories. Realistic scenarios. Where does sustained pressure lead? Multiple pathways exist, none predetermined, all dependent on decisions not yet made. Consider the possibilities through strategic logic rather than predictive certainty. Scenario 1. Prolonged containment. Iran remains sanctioned but stable. The regime survives through adaptation rather than capitulation. Regional influence diminishes but doesn't disappear. Proxy relationships continue at reduced intensity. This becomes the new equilibrium. Not resolution, not escalation. Frozen conflict extended indefinitely. The North Korea model applied to a larger, more regionally integrated state. Scenario 2. Hardened tone. Escalation through miscalculation. Pressure continues. Iran conducts increasingly bold proxy operations to demonstrate it won't be strangled passively. An attack crosses a threshold Washington can't ignore. Military response follows. Not full invasion. American public appetite for Middle East wars has diminished, but sustained air campaigns. Cyber warfare intensification. Naval blockades formalized. The region destabilizes further. Oil prices surge. Global economic implications follow. Did anyone intend this outcome? Not necessarily. But did the pressure dynamics make it more probable? Arguably, yes. Scenario 3. Negotiated reset. A different administration or changed circumstances within the Trump framework creates opening for revised negotiations. Iran accepts more stringent restrictions. The U.S. provides sanctions relief and security guarantees. Regional states get included in broader frameworks. This requires all parties accepting outcomes less than their maximal positions. Is this likely given positions hardened through years of confrontation? The obstacles are substantial, but diplomatic resolutions often appear impossible until they occur. Scenario 4. Regional realignment. The pressure on Iran accelerates a broader Middle East restructure. Arab states and Israel formalize security cooperation against perceived Iranian threat. Turkey, with its own regional ambitions, maneuvers between camps. Russia maintains influence through arms sales and diplomatic positioning. China focuses on economic access regardless of political tensions. Iran becomes progressively isolated in a region where former divisions have been replaced by new alliances. This isn't speculation. Elements of this were already observable during the maximum pressure period. The Abraham Accords weren't just bilateral agreements. They represented tectonic shifts in regional alignment patterns. But there's a deeper question beneath these scenarios. Was the confrontation with Iran ever primarily about Iranian policy, or was it about demonstrating a template for economic coercion? Sanctions had been used before, certainly, but the comprehensiveness, the integration of financial system leverage, the coordination of diplomatic isolation with military signaling, this represented something more systematic, a methodology. If economic architecture can be weaponized this effectively against Iran, what prevents similar application elsewhere? The precedent problem. Venezuela received similar treatment: sanctions, diplomatic isolation, recognition of opposition figures as legitimate government. Russia faced sanctions over Ukraine, election interference, various incidents. China entered trade wars combined with technology restrictions. Different context, different justifications, but similar tools. The pattern suggested that economic pressure backed by military capability had become the primary instrument of American foreign policy execution. This creates strategic implications beyond any single confrontation. If the international order operates on economic coercion rather than negotiated frameworks, every state must calculate how vulnerable they are to similar pressure. Does this drive countries toward developing sanctions-resistant systems? Probably. Does it accelerate moves away from dollar-denominated trade? The data suggests this was already occurring, particularly between China, Russia, and targeted states. Iran's experience became a case study for others. Survive the pressure long enough, adapt your economic structures, maintain internal control, cultivate alternative partnerships. Regime survival remains possible even under maximum pressure. This wasn't the lesson Washington intended to teach, but it's potentially what other adversarial states observed and learned. Conclusion: where does this lead next? The Iran confrontation didn't end with a definitive resolution. The maximum pressure campaign delivered economic damage. It constrained Iranian regional activities to some degree. It demonstrated American willingness to use financial system dominance aggressively. But did it achieve its stated objectives? The answer depends on which objectives you identify as primary. If the goal was forcing Iran to negotiate from a position of weakness that remained unachieved by the time Trump left office, if the goal was demonstrating to regional allies that Washington would confront Tehran decisively, that succeeded. If the goal was testing how far economic warfare could push a mid-sized power without triggering uncontrollable escalation, data was certainly gathered. But perhaps the most significant outcome wasn't about Iran at all. It was about establishing precedent, showing that treaty commitments could be discarded unilaterally, demonstrating that economic sanctions could be weaponized at unprecedented scale, proving that military threats could be maintained indefinitely without execution, creating sustained pressure through uncertainty itself. The next administration faced the inheritance of this approach. Return to the nuclear agreement. Iran's position had hardened. Its nuclear program had advanced beyond previous restrictions during the maximum pressure period. Regional states that had benefited from Iran's isolation opposed American-Iranian rapprochement. The situation had evolved beyond simple policy reversal, and that raises the fundamental question about pressure campaigns. What happens after maximum pressure? If it doesn't produce capitulation, if the target adapts and survives, if regional dynamics shift in ways that make returning to previous arrangements impossible, has the pressure created resolution or merely created a new, potentially more unstable status quo? The real question may not be what happened to Iran under maximum pressure. It may be what this approach revealed about modern power dynamics, economic systems as weapons, diplomatic isolation as strategy, military threats as atmosphere rather than specific plans, traditional concepts of war and peace becoming inadequate categories for describing sustained confrontation that involves neither treaty nor combat, but somehow both simultaneously. Iran survived. America didn't invade, but the Middle East transformed around the confrontation. Alliances shifted, enmities calcified, alternative systems began developing to root around sanctions architectures. The conflict over Iran may have been less about Iran and more about demonstrating the tools available in a new kind of confrontation. Economic warfare replacing military conquest, sustained pressure replacing decisive action, strategic ambiguity replacing clear objectives. The real question may not be what happened, but what this made possible next. What pressures might be applied elsewhere using this template? Which countries observed and adapted? Which alliances formed in response? Which systems developed to resist similar campaigns? Iran was the laboratory. The experiment produced results. But results aren't conclusions. They're data points for what comes after. And what comes after, that's the tension that remains unresolved.